Now, with the recent racial tensions arising from the Senekal unrest and the response from the political parties seemingly along racial lines, are we seeing the continued rise of race politics in South Africa? And is the left-wing and right-wing politics good for democracy in South Africa? Associate Professor at the Wits School of Governance, Professor William Gumede, as well as author and writer for Newzroom Afrika, McMichael, joining me now to unpack this further. Gentlemen, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight. Of course, racial tensions in South Africa are not something that we are seeing now in the last 2 weeks. It's something that has been with us for a while now, and we've been seeing it on and off. And of course, these last 2 weeks, we are seeing the spillover of that kind of tension also playing out now in Senekal. Now, in 2019, Professor Gumede, you wrote that the rise of the economic freedom fighters in the elections in 2019 has ushered in the arrival of a black leftist populism as a standalone strand and strong popular appeal within South African politics. While, Christopher, on the other hand, you've just written now in October that the radical far right thrives in times of political and economic instability. Prof. Gumede, I'll start with you. What are we seeing playing out in South Africa right now? Professor, what are we seeing playing out in South Africa right now in terms of the left and the right politics?
I mean, I think the very first thing we must start off is just to say that we've got a breakdown of law and order first. I think that is really the very first thing. And then secondly, in this breakdown of law and order, we have untouchables in the country who's been, using the space. When I say untouchables, people that seems to be above the law. And, and that's been going on for a long while. For example, gangsters, for example, politically connected politicians who've been above the law. And I think what has happened now is that it seems, in this breakdown of law, not only is there a breakdown of the law, but the state has also lost its authority and its credibility because of, service failures, because of the high levels of corruption and so. The president is not always in the kind of assessment. So in that vacuum of all of these things that are happening, we also have the COVID-19 financial crisis, which has made people, losing their livelihoods and their job. There's also, this atmosphere has also almost created a sense of unease among society, and people are jittery. All of this is almost which is now being exploited by, on the one hand, left populism, and on the other hand, right-wing forces, but also on the, thirdly, people who can mobilize are using it to, to assert their power. Whether it's taxi bosses on the one hand, or whether it is now the right-wing on the other hand, or the left populists on the other hand.
How dangerous, Christopher, is this exploitation of the situations on the ground? Things like economic difficulty, hardship that many people are experiencing, and of course the various formations exploiting that kind of experience to forward and intensify their messaging or their narrative. How dangerous is that to our democracy?
Well, I think it is a very dangerous time because, we have a lot of very deep economic and social problems that have been very drastically escalated by the pandemic and the kind of economic aftershock of that. And I think if you look at what's happened with Senekal, so what happened was the initial sort of inciting incident was this very tragic murder of a young white farm worker. And I think, as we all know, crime and violent crime in particular, is a very, very severe social problem in South Africa, which, affects people in rural areas, it affects people in urban areas. And it's a very visceral sort of problem. But I think what happened initially with Senekal is that sort of what we would call the far right in South Africa, which is groups like, for example, AfroForum, have tried to capitalize it and sort of take kind of anger around crime and to steer it in a very particular direction. And I think now what's happened with the EFF and Julius Malema, and I think something to maybe point out is that at Malema's trial today in Randburg, AfriForum has actually been there kind of covering the trial. So I think that there's a lot of sort of political theater going on around the trial. And I think it's actually, obscuring these deeper issues of kind of crime and sort of social breakdown. But I think the particular immediate danger might be that we could see some more violence on Friday. And I don't think that necessarily we should be too alarmist about it. Because, for example, if you go online now, you'll see sort of white right-wingers, talking about a civil war and these kind of things. And I think that's a lot of bluster. But I do think with this particular thing, it could result in, some violence. And I think it's a very sort of fraught situation at the moment.
Now, this kind of populism, quite seductive and quite appealing to the media in South Africa. Is the media doing justice in terms of their coverage to cover both sides or both ends of it and reveal it for really what it is? Christopher?
Well, I think something that's happened is that there's been, especially, I think we should also look at the global kind of context, because I think as we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years with things like, for example, Trump in the United States, the sort of extreme polarization of social media in particular, there have been a lot of sort of new political currents which have been emerging. And I think that's the media in a lot of ways hasn't really kept up with that. And I think in some ways extremist groups can sort of capitalize on that, as a way of sort of disguising their message and sort of slipping it into the media. But I also think something I would like to suggest personally, I think that if you look at the sort of far right in South Africa, which is, both online and then actual organizations, they've been sort of unanimous in their, support of Senekal and, have been very sort of vocal in justifying the rampage that happened last week. But I also think that I don't think you can necessarily say that the EFF represents this kind of, unitary far left in South Africa where sort of everyone is supporting the EFF. And I think that within the sort of the white right wing in South Africa, they are much more of a sort of a force that has a sort of a shared kind of language and agenda. So I don't think we should necessarily, reduce it to the simple argument of sort of, both sides. Yeah. I think it's a case of the far right trying to capitalize on this, and I think Julius Malema has politically seen this as an opportunity to capitalize on.
All right, Christopher, stay with me. Professor Gumede, stay with me. I want to continue with you after the break on that very same conversation. The Newsfeed Late Night continues next. Thanks for staying on the Newsfeed Late Night with me, Associate Professor at Wits School of Governance, Professor William Gumede, as well as author and writer of New Frame, Christopher McMichael. Professor Gumede, what we are hearing, for example, in that clip we played moments ago from Julius Malema, is that they are heading to Senekal to deal with white arrogance, and they are there to protect the constitutional order of this country. And then you hear on the other side farmers saying, well, farmers are angry. They've had enough, and the kind of reaction that you saw on the farm was out of anger. And this is what happens when people have had enough. That kind of hate talk, Are we normalizing it in society? Is that becoming our language?
Sadly, it has become our language, and so on. And, it is not a role of, the populists on the left or the right-wingers, on the right, on the white right or the left populism, to take the role of the state, to protect. There's, when it comes to protection and to restore law and order, that's the role of the states, not a political formation. So, that's the very first thing that's totally wrong. Of course, the state will have to intervene to lay down the line and to bring law and order. And of course, unfortunately, the state is also very weak at the moment because it is not delivering. It's perceived to be corrupt, and some people are getting away who are also unruly within government themselves. So that really reduces the credibility of the state and the authority of the state itself. Nevertheless, it is, we can't have political forces, whether on the right or on the left, now trying to want to intervene and trying to so-called protect law and order. We cannot do that. They're undermining the state if they do that.
Christopher, how do terms like farm murder, for example, and terms like South Africa is now under foreign rule, how does that impact and how does this play into what is happening?
I think phrases like that. So, for example, farm murder is often the implication with the sort of far right is that there is either a conspiracy to cover this up from government, or it's a the government is actively not working to prevent farm murders. And then simultaneously with these kind of South Africa first, South Africa for South African kind of arguments, I think they're very seductive and appealing, because I think people, as Professor Gumede has pointed out, people can see the very, very visceral, very immediate failings of the state in South Africa. And I think, these kind of explanations, such as the xenophobic one, which is that, South Africa's socio-economic problems are being caused by migrants from Africa or Asia, they connect with people on a very sort of visceral, kind of emotional level, because it provides an explanation for, why society seems to be becoming sort of worse and more materially deprived. And I think one of the things the media can do is often kind of replicate this language, even if it's not direct. So, for example, the media will often, use phrases like illegal immigrants and, talk about sort of borders and immigration in a way that, even if it's not necessarily intended to be xenophobic, can kind of reinforce that. And so I also think as well that a lot of the time in the media, I think there's a lot of distrust about the media in South Africa, especially after the last 10 years. And I think a lot of the time there's a feeling that perhaps the media isn't really connecting with people's on the real, sort of on the ground, real life experiences. And I think that kind of space is an opening for sort of, things like, for example, xenophobic or racist politics to flourish.
What would it take, Professor Gumede, I suppose, to bring the country's politics more or less to the center, not to the extremes, whether it's to the left or to the right, in terms of the political formations that are there right now?
I think the very first thing is our language should become less violent. The last decades, the language has become very violent, our political language. I mean, struggle slogans, for example, yes, it has their place, but, we have to really look at our language and our political conduct. Our discourse has been too violent. That's the very first thing that we have to moderate and relook. Even our struggle slogans has been very violent, and of course there was a time for that. This is now a democracy, so we cannot engage our public discourse in violence, and because violence has become legitimate in our words. That's the second thing. What we will need to do is, our leadership of the country, starting with President Cyril Ramaphosa, there has to be much more direction, to give confidence to people, to citizens across the country, where the rule of law, should really be implemented. And we should not have untouchables in the country. The moment there are untouchables in the country, it opens up the space, for left populism to take the law into their own hands, white right wing to take the law into their own hands, taxi bosses to take the land into their own, and even community members, whether in this xenophobia type of incidents, because there is no leadership at the top. So we'll have to have a leadership. And then the third thing is the state must start to deliver and to be seen to be delivered. So we don't have people who live in the state of not knowing what's going on in the country. They feel that they don't have jobs and the economic situation is not improving. They're starting to blame either as foreigners that they start to blame, or if you're black, you blame the whites. If you're white, you blame the blacks, because across the country, it just seems that things are not working, and at the same time, there is just no leadership that shows us a direction when things are not working.
Yeah. And do you think the current ruling ANC is the party that will give that kind of leadership, also provide that kind of certainty? I mean, considering the kind of left-wing, right-wing politics that are happening even within that own organization itself.
Our problem really is the political violence that also happening in the center of the ANC itself. I mean, if you look at, firstly, the violent language between opponents within the party itself. That's the very, very first thing. Within the governing party, they're supposed to bring the stability and the credibility. Unfortunately, the ANC is divided, and the divisions are often, settled through either violent language or violence themselves. I mean, if you just look at a local level, where even in the competition for positions, we see, people are assassinated within the party itself. So, but we haven't seen the party coming down against people using violent language or against people using violence against, their opponents within the ANC itself. So that's, so when you have the governing party appears to have using violence also within the party itself, that spills over into the state and also into society, because people say, well, the governing party used violence with a violent language or violence to tackle their own opponents within the party. We might also use violence to deal with our opponents.
Yeah. Christopher, would you say we are in a state of post-apartheid paranoia, and how do we deal with that?
I think there is a lot of paranoia in South Africa, and I think a lot of that paranoia, people are trying to sort of weaponize it in politics and culture, both on the sort of left and on the right. I think there's two things. I think as the professor said now, again, one of the problems is that, there doesn't seem to be a kind of an implementation and a direction. So, for example, if you read President Ramaphosa's letter on the Senekal violence, I thought it was a very sort of measured and kind of reasonable response. The problem is how does that get implemented? And I also think another problem with violence in South Africa is that violence itself has been deeply entrenched, especially within the South African police, because the police do have a very extreme record of murdering sort of unarmed civilians and attacking protesters. So I also think there needs to be substantial reform and overhaul of the state's own security institutions, in particular the police. But I think one of the things that South Africa really needs is a sort of is not just, because I think we all know what the problems are. We know that we've got this kind of economy that doesn't seem to be working. The state itself seems to be completely dysfunctional. So we know what the problems are. But I think something that's needed is a sort of a mass politics, and maybe that's going to come from civil society pressure or from the unions, but some sort of forward direction. So instead of it being, sort of this zero-sum game of white against black, or black against white, or South African citizen against xenophobia, we need some kind of politics which is going to, reconstruct our economy and, push us forward. And we need some kind of collective emancipatory politics, which I think can, have a direction and actually deal with problems like violent crime and the socio-economic causes of them. Because I think,
Christopher, you're saying that if there was economic stability, if the economy was doing well, people were working, there were jobs, we'll probably be seeing less type of this tension?
Obviously, it's it's not just economic factors, but I definitely think it's a substantial cause of it. And I think, especially with sort of scapegoating. So, for example, you see how sort of immigrants are blamed for South Africa's economic problems. And I think, if anything, this is kind of an indictment of the current system and how the state and big business themselves have failed to really create an economy which is viable for the masses of people.
Yeah.
In the society, and that's obviously like a much bigger question. But
absolutely, unfortunately, a question that we don't have time to tackle properly right now. Christopher, let me thank you very much for joining us. Christopher, he is an author, writer for New Frame in Johannesburg, as well as Professor William Gumede, Associate Professor at Wits University.